On behalf of the Friday Institute, thank you so much for joining us today for the continuation of our discussion for secondary educators on remote learning. My name is Shayla Rexroad. I am absolutely thrilled to be here today with my partner in crime, Laura Albright. Let me get moved ahead a little bit. Laura is going to be behind the scenes a little bit today, helping me out, moderating the Zoom. So if you have specific questions, she will hopefully be able to address them. She is also going to be populating the chat with links to some of the resources that we're going to be sharing. So anything like that that you might need, please be sure to check the chat to be able to get that. Again, my name is Shayla Rexroad. I know previously you may have been joined by Emmy Coleman. As you will quickly learn at the Friday Institute, we like to share in the opportunities. And selfishly, I love the opportunity to get to work with secondary teachers, especially in the realm of remote learning. So I kind of wedged my way into this one. So I hope the information that we are able to share today will be beneficial and you will find it to be to your benefit. If you are on Twitter, we would love to have you following us at #FIConnects. Again, even if you just share the good news, encourage your colleagues and friends to join us for the next one, the more the merrier. We are utilizing the Zoom platform. Some of you may be better versed in this at this point than you ever thought you would be. For those of you who are new to Zoom, I just wanted to point out a couple of the features that will prove useful during our session today. A lot of you have already found the chat feature. I see you populating your name, your school, and your district there. If you have not done so already and want to give the chat window a go, we would love to hear from you there. You may also recognize that you can see screenshots or small thumbnails of everyone who has joined. If you find those to be distracting, you can minimize those. You can also change whether or not they're on the left side, the right side, where they're positioned. Just kind of grab that area of the images and move them around on your screen. You are currently set up in mute mode, and that's just simply to help with some of the background noise. But if at any point you want to come off of unmute and ask a question, provide a resource, just share additional information about some of the things that we are sharing, if you just scroll down on your screen to that mute button, click it, you will come off of unmute and we will be able to hear you. And lastly, especially with all that we've been focusing on with remote learning, specifically with our students and accessibility, you also have a closed captioning feature along the bottom of your screen. So that is something that if that is really helpful and beneficial to you, it is something that you can click on and activate for yourself. It is also a great feature to know is available for your students who that may be an accessibility feature for them as well. For those of you not familiar with the Friday Institute, we are located on the NC State campus. We are part of Centennial Campus. And we like to think of the Friday Institute as this amazing hub where policy, practice, and research all come together. There are several teams within the Friday Institute that focus on everything from research to helping to influence and impact policy in the realm of education. Our group in particular, we are the Professional Learning and Leading Collaborative. We focus primarily on researching, developing, and delivering professional learning for educators across the state of North Carolina. So as soon as COVID-19 kicked in and we recognized that, oh my goodness, all of these students, all of these teachers are going to be trying to tackle instruction from home, we immediately jumped in and we're really honored to be able to partner with a lot of different organizations across the state to start having these conversations. We recognize how important having these conversations can be because we are all truly learning this together. Again, a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today are lessons learned, things that I'm going out and researching and finding, webinars that I'm joining myself in order to try to really navigate and figure out how best do we meet the needs of our students, how best do we make sure that your needs are also being met as educators, and ultimately, how are we preparing our students when they do come back to school. For these conversations, please know that they are research-based. We spend a lot of time diving into the research, looking to see what are those methodologies, what does the pedagogy tell us about great instruction, especially in a remote setting. They are designed specifically for you. So the resources, the information I'm going to be sharing are designed for middle to high school grades. These are extremely inclusive and informal. So at any point, please do not hesitate to come off of mute and ask a question. These are designed to be very different from a traditional webinar, in that a webinar is a lot of the facilitator doing all the talking and maybe answering a couple of questions at the end. You are very quickly going to find that along the way, I'm going to be asking you for feedback. So you can do that feedback one of two ways. Again, you can come off of mute and share, or you can populate your answers in the chat. But again, we want this to be very informal, very relaxed, and really feel like a conversation amongst friends. So in order to get us started, it's kind of, I don't know, I'm based out of the Clayton, North Carolina area. I don't know what the weather's like and all the different places that you're coming from, but it's kind of cloudy, overcast, kind of that Wednesday hump day. And I thought it'd be really great to kick things off by really firing up our brains. We might be in that lull of the day. So in order to talk and to fire up our brains a little bit, I'm going to share with you a series of riddles, and I want to see if you can answer them. You can either answer them to yourself, or if you're willing to share what you think the answers are in the chat, we would love to hear from you. So here is your very first one. They're going to start a little easy and get a little bit harder. So here is your first one. Can you solve the riddle? So if you do want to populate your answer in the chat, you're more than welcome to, or you can simply hold it in your head. Oh, nice. I see a couple of responses coming in, and you are correct. If you answered top secret, you are correct. I love brain teasers. I have 10-year-old twins, and brain teasers and riddles have really been what's kind of kept us going and get us going in the mornings. So here is your next one, a little bit harder. How many legs does the elephant have? So when you see this elephant, how many legs does it have? I'll give you a minute to look at it, and then if you're willing to share, pop it into the chat. Let's see, a couple, I see 5. Anybody think it's more or less? Nice, ooh, a lot of 5s. Well, I'm very sad to say this elephant actually only has 4 legs. And I see that some of you are populating it with 4. Again, kind of a trick of the eye, how it was designed, the shadowing, the effects on the screen, a lot of different things that can impact how you are viewing the elephant. So here is the next one. Are the 2 squares different colors? So are an A and B the same color or different colors? I'll give you a couple of seconds to study it and look at it. Oh, I hear some different. Anybody that thinks they're alike? Oh, a lot of different, some that say the same. Nice. This is one that I'll be perfectly honest, it really hung me up for a minute. I was like, what? Especially when I figured out the answer. But then I'm going to show you the trick to the answer. So the answer is actually no. They are actually the same color. If you don't believe me, place your finger through the middle of A and B, and I'm going to move an arrow in there. When you place your finger over the space between A and B, you will see that B is actually the same color. Again, total trick of the eye, how things are perceived and how they look on the screen can be very different. So thank you to those who jumped into the chat and shared a little bit. So this leads us to this whole conversation around how well do we really understand how students learn remotely? How do we know that what they're seeing on the screen, the information that they're hearing, everything that you're sharing with them, how do we know it's actually being received? How do we know, how do they demonstrate that mastery? Because where we could typically kind of read body language in our classrooms, we would know our students, we could walk around the room, we could re-engage with some that looked like maybe they were disengaged a little bit. When you're working remotely, it's quite different, as most of you have probably already experienced. So we're going to dive a little bit more into what exactly is happening in your brain, in the brains of our students when you are teaching, but more importantly, when you are teaching remotely. So in order to understand this better, we're going to do a really quick review on how the brain works. And if any of you logging in are my high school biology or science people, we'll totally turn to you again. Please respect, this is a very abbreviated version, but it's to help get us in a space of really understanding what's happening in our students' brains as we are delivering instruction to them remotely or in person. So here we go. When we are talking about the brain, we are talking about these areas of working memory, the prefrontal cortex, the episodic memory, the long-term memory, all those things, the sensory register, all the components, all the different parts of the brain that we know work in conjunction with one another. They are working seamlessly together in order to help us function, in order to help our bodies function on a day-to-day basis. Here is a very brief overview of essentially what happens when information is presented to your brain. So it starts by receiving some type of stimuli. That could be they hear somebody say something, they see something, they feel something, but something triggers their brain to, in some shape, form, or capacity, to react. That stimuli then moves that information, or that information that's been received, it moves into the sensory register. From the sensory register, it moves and makes its way onto working memory, and then hopefully it makes its way from working memory into long-term memory. But as simple as I may have just summarized that, it is far from simple, because although this image makes it appear as if learning is linear, it's absolutely not. We all know, again, as educators and working with so many different diverse learners over the years, that learning is way more complex than that. But again, we're going to continue to break it down a little bit more and then put it to the test. So when you think about the sensory register, so I'm going to bop back here for just a second. We started with something is introduced to your brain and it moves to the sensory register. A really quick way to kind of think about the sensory register is it kind of serves as your brain's bouncer. So I kind of imagine there's a big bouncer in my brain, and as soon as that information leaves from the stimuli, that bouncer is there to determine what's going to get through and what's not. Shockingly enough, when myself and some colleagues were doing research around learning sciences, we learned that the bouncer discards 98% of what we see, hear, smell, and touch. It considers it to be completely irrelevant. In other words, only 2% of what we teach sticks the first time with our students. Now, I emphasize the first time. But again, maybe some connections are starting to happen with you of, wow, maybe that's why when I do this phenomenal lesson and the very next day my students come back to me and I say, remember when we covered this? They look at me with blank stares, or there's crickets in the room. It's because in reality, if they've only heard it that one time, only about 2% of that information has actually carried on to working memory. When we get into working memory, once it kind of makes its way through the sensory register, it goes to live here in order for your brain to kind of mull it over. But it's a very brief amount of time. Your brain takes about 15 seconds to determine if it's going to keep that information and store it and kind of move it around and process it to make it into long-term memory, or if it's going to say, I'm going to dump it. It's not important to me. It's not relevant to me. Don't know what I'm going to do with this, and it says, see ya. So it's this question of what stays and what is forgotten. How do we create those learning experiences for our students, especially in a remote setting, that is going to help that information move start off as the stimuli, move into that sensory cortex, and then make its way into working memory and ultimately into long-term memory. Now, some of you may be sitting there saying to yourself, I'm not so sure about that. I think that more information than that makes it through the first time you hear it. I think the brain takes longer than 15 seconds to determine what it's going to keep or forget. So I'm actually going to let you put it to the test. So don't panic. You're not going to be graded on this one. But if you do have a piece of paper and a pencil nearby, you may want to grab it. Or if you want to open a small window, like a notepad or something, or Word or Google Docs on your computer in order to be able to type, you can do that. If not, you're totally fine. You can still fully participate. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you through a series of really quick memory tests to see how quickly does it take your brain, once it is stimulated, to start to process and retain information. So for this very first one, you're not going to write anything down until I tell you. But right now, you're going to have 5 seconds. I'm going to show you a series of letters. And I want you to see how many of these letters in the series can you remember. Again, you're not writing anything down right now. You're just testing your own working memory. But let's see, how many can you remember in 5 seconds? So here we go. All right, I'm going to give you just a minute. Write down what you remember. Did I have anybody who remembered more than 5 letters? Oh, nice. Anybody who remembered more than 10? Oh, 8 maybe. Got some good ones out there. Some of you may have been a little shocked. It kind of is a jolt to the brain of, what? I know I just saw these letters. I thought for sure I remembered some of them. And yes, that question of, I don't know, I think I remembered them correctly. Well, guess what? I'm going to let you try it again. So this time, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to memorize the following letters on the next page. Here we go. Okay, write down what you remember. All right, I'm going to take you back. Do I have anybody that got all 5? That you were able to remember all 5, regardless if they were in order, but you were able to remember all 5. Nice, nice. Okay. Believe it or not, these are the exact same letters that I gave you previously. They're just presented a little differently. Right? And we're going to talk about why that makes a difference in just a minute. So nice job. All right, so here's your next test. Okay, let me get back to my screen. Can you identify these? These you can write down. You don't have to try to memorize them. But can you identify what each of these symbols represents within our culture? All right, let's see how well you may have done. Did you answer Starbucks, Michael Jordan or Air Jordan? Both can be acceptable. McDonald's, Diet Coke, and Superman. Okay, nicely done. Again, so I put your brain to the test in a couple of different ways. But that leaves us with this really big question. Why were you able to remember some of the information, but not all of it? What was really happening in your brain that, again, allowed some of this information over time to make its way through working memory? And in some instances, like with the images, why was it that you knew what those images meant? Is it because you personally interacted with those things? Is it because you've seen them frequently? There's a lot of different things that are happening within your brain that make a difference. Here are some of the things that allowed you to remember some information, but not all of it. First, your brain was attracted, the attention, it got you excited. It was something that you went, ooh, you had some type of emotional response. Think back to the television stations. You might have immediately seen one and your brain went to a favorite show, someone on one of those shows that you really like, a news station, lots of different things that it evoked an emotion. You immediately had a connection with those, which again makes it very easy for your brain to start to process and remember it. Information was presented in small chunks. So the very first time I gave you the whole string of letters, that was a lot for your brain to try to move back and forth and to try to make sense of. The second time, I simply took those letters and I put them into small groups. I chunk them. I also color coded. So if you remember, I had one in black and then the next one was in like a blue color to allow your brain to decipher between the different bits of information. I also shifted how much time that you had. So the very first time with a string of letters, I gave you 5 seconds. The second time, I gave you 10 seconds. I gave you a little bit longer. I gave a little bit more wait time for you to stop and process the information. The other thing that I did is while I was asking you to study those words, I didn't try talking to you. I didn't ask you questions. I didn't try to engage in conversation with you. I completely allowed that silent wait time to happen so that your brain could fully focus on the information presented in front of you. And lastly, for a lot of these items, you might have attached meaning to it, which is what allows it to really stay stored in your long-term memory. For some of you, I may have evoked sadness as you saw your beloved Starbucks or your beloved Diet Cokes or your McDonald's that some of us have not been able to visit in so long and we're craving and missing. For others, it was a memory of the past. For me, seeing the Michael Jordan emblem and being alive and remembering when Michael Jordan played with the Chicago Bulls and the excitement of watching him play. So lots of different emotions, lots of different meaning was attached to those for you as well as for me whenever I looked at them. So again, my brain processed it beyond just looking at an image. Stories started to come about, memories, different ways that I have interacted with those images allowed me to process and understand and remember that information. So what in the world does all of this have to do with teaching and learning remotely? It's all about how we decide to make learning stick. What are some of the things that we can start to think about, recognizing we are teaching in a different type of space, but recognizing teaching and learning can still happen? Again, encouraging active engagement, encouraging your students do things like where you give them bits of information, you give them time to process, and then share and talk a little bit about their reaction to it. Continuing to tap into what students already know. A lot of researchers are telling us now is probably not the best time to introduce all brand new information. Going back and taking the time to do that review of prior information is extremely critical right now. Doesn't mean you can't introduce new content, but making sure that you are dedicating sufficient time to review before you jump into anything new. Make it personal and relevant to your students. Try to build those connections where if it's something new that you're sharing, try to share a story or give them the opportunity to process the information and to share a little bit about how's your brain feeling right now? Is your brain feeling really good? Is it really tired? Is it really confused? Like what's happening right now? And getting them to also stop and recognize how they learn and how they are able to process information. I love to use storytelling. I share stories all the time, and they don't always have to be my own personal stories. Sometimes I share the stories that I've heard colleagues share about different things. But again, we tend to retain and remember information when it's shared in the form of a story. And keep it simple and fresh. As you're going to see on the slides that I present, I put a little bit of information, a graphic, and then I let a lot of my storytelling and my explanation do most of the work. Because again, you don't want to overwhelm them with information on the screen because their brains are trying to process it. If you do, give them that sufficient wait time to read what's on the screen before you start explaining or talking more about it. So I would love to hear from you. How have you created remote learning experiences that stick? Have you found some really creative ways to engage your students? Is it starting with something like brain teasers? Is it recording and providing those back? Is it getting your students to make recordings? What are ways that you have been really creative? And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you came up with yourself. It could be, nope, totally borrowed, stole, begged, and got this from another colleague, saw it from somebody else, but it's been really great. So would love to hear from you in the chat if you are willing to share some of the things that you're doing right now. Yes, brain teasers are always a great way to get your students engaged. And again, just like I did, you can have some who are willing to share in the chat or to talk verbally and share their answers. But then for others, it's completely fine if they just want to process it on their own. So when we start to think about crafting a mini lesson that supports all learners, it's really important, again, to think back to what we just learned about how the brain works. Being very careful not only about the amount of information that you share, but also how it's being presented to your students. Is it being presented in a way that they can take the information from the screen, take the information that they are verbally hearing, and to be able to process that information in a meaningful and relevant way? So this is where you may have seen this graphic. It is one that several of us on our team continue to come back to and refer to. And it is a document that came out of Kansas very early on when all of the COVID-19 started to hit. They were one of the first states to go ahead and release students to learning from home. And they did a lot of research and found that really when you are trying to hold students accountable for learning each day in a remote space, what is that ideal amount of time that you can expect to really keep them engaged? And some of you may be hyperventilating right now when you see the grade 6 to 12, the 30 minutes per teacher. And the reason for that being is that your students have multiple teachers. So if every teacher tries to take an hour to an hour and a half, that adds up to a 6-hour day for some of your students, which every bit of research tells us you've lost them. So really stopping to think about, I've got 30 minutes with my students, how do I really make it stick? But also recognizing less time does not necessarily mean less learning that can happen. Again, we just saw that in a very short amount of time, information is presented in a very concise way. Your students absolutely have the capacity to retain it, but then how you ask them to continue to work with that information after your sessions is going to be really critical to that information making its way through to long-term memory. So consider differentiating your lessons. Again, you have limited time, but make the most of it. Use visuals when you can. Chunk the information. Again, give 2 or 3 bits of information on a screen, give them time to look at it and process it, and then have a conversation about it. And also provide sufficient wait time. Again, recognizing that how information is being perceived across the screen can be different for different students, especially if they are not used to learning off of a device. If having a device in their home is not something that's frequently there, or it's not something they had a ton of exposure to in school, just simply sitting and adjusting their vision to being able to look at something on a screen and then being able to respond can be very different for students. And Laura dropped the resource from Kansas into the chat window. She'll continue to do that. It's a really great document. It has a lot of other really helpful information, but this was one piece that our team really kind of gravitated towards because it made a lot of sense with the research, and it's really served as a good guide for us as well. Also, when you start to think about the general design of your lesson, so given you have 30 minutes with your students, what are some of the types of ways that you might maximize and utilize that 30 minutes? This is actually a condensed version from a larger chart, which we will share, that talks about all the different ways that you can think about utilizing your 30 minutes. One way is to do a model called demonstrate and try. If you are teaching synchronously, which means you are talking to them live like we are right now, it could be where you show them how to do something, and then you have a screen where you give them time to try it themselves, or you give them time to respond in the chat, or to have correspondence with a friend. If you are teaching asynchronous, meaning that you are not live with them, recognizing that you have some students that may not be able to join you real time, this is where you may take advantage of things like screencast or recording, where you actually record your lesson ahead of time, but still build in the wait time. I know it seems really strange, and the example that they give on the graph is, if any of you have ever watched Dora the Explorer on Nickelodeon, she talks to the screen all the time, but she's talking to the kids that she knows are watching. they encourage you to do the exact same thing. Yes, some of your students may kind of tilt their head a little bit and think, wow, how's my teacher doing with all this remote time? But you would be amazed at what a difference it makes. And secretly, you will probably find that you have some students that admit that they talk back to you, even though it's a recording. Again, just that opportunity for you to demonstrate something and then give them time to try it. Another technique is watch, listen, and respond. So again, this might be where you post a lesson ahead of time, very similar to the flipped classroom approach, where you post something ahead of time, a really short video clip of you teaching, sharing something. It could be a YouTube video instructing them on something. It could be an article that you share with them. I've seen a lot of secondary teachers that are starting to find some really amazing podcasts, and they are encouraging their students to listen to the podcast. Then when you have them live, you're using that time to really respond together to what it was that they watched, what they read, or the podcast that they're listening to. Also, another great one is to encourage them to say, all right, for this particular lesson, we're going to focus on what it is that you're going to create. This could be after you've taught for 2 or 3 lessons and it's, all right, now let's really spend some time creating. But here are some things that they really stressed that I thought were really great is those sentence starters, especially for your EC or ELL or English language students. Having those consistent sentence starters will help them to very clearly understand what you're asking them to do. So starting off with, today you're going to, and then explain what it is that you want them to do. Be very clear with them about where they need to share it. And I've even started to see where secondary teachers, they are popping out and making a really quick screencast or even doing a Zoom session, demonstrating to the students how to navigate in the LMS, how to post it. Also, everything down to how they should label it. If you want it to be their last name and the date and the name of the assignment, be very clear with them about how they should be sharing information back with you. And one that I absolutely love is letting them know about how long they should be spending on this activity, given if they truly understood and have mastered the information. Again, there's always going to be caveats that if they don't sit down and dedicate, if you tell them it should take them 30 minutes, tell them, well, if you do 15, then it should take you another 15, depending on how they chunk out their time. But giving them a total amount of time that it should take them to complete it will also help them to find structure in their day, recognizing that they are juggling multiple classes and multiple assignments. It will help them to kind of start to create a priority list of, well, this teacher's assignment, they've told me it's going to take about 30 minutes, but this one's going to take me an hour. Right now, I have about 30 minutes before I have to go and help with dinner or I have to watch siblings. So I'm going to go ahead and work on that one right now. Again, giving them those parameters will help them to structure their day and feel like they can be successful with the lessons. Couple of other general tips for remote instruction. This one's actually adapted from Todd Findlay. If you are on Twitter and you don't follow Todd, I would highly recommend that you do. He does a great job of posting lots of graphics, charts, graphs. He is actually out of East Carolina University is where he's done a lot of his work. I'm not sure if he's still there now, but I know he was for years. He's worked with several of my friends and colleagues. But this is adapted from one of his charts where he talks about that there are 3 types of interaction that are happening during remote instruction. The first is learner content. So you've got a learner, they're processing information, they solely interact with the content. This could be where you send them an article and it's just them reading the article and posting comments or just taking down notes from what it is that they've read. The second type of interaction is that happens between the learner and the teacher. So again, that could be live instruction, that could be asynchronous instruction. It can take lots of different forms, but it's gone from just them working in isolation with the content to now they're interacting with you as the teacher in addition to that content. The third interaction, which is the one we're really going to kind of dive a little bit deeper into, is this idea of learner-learner. This is something that a lot of your students are probably craving right now. They are desperate to have interaction with their peers. So this is really where the trifecta of all 3 come together. They've been exposed to the content. They've had an opportunity to learn and interact with you as the instructor, But now it's really critical to start to think about what are ways that you are providing students the opportunity to interact collectively together to further process the information, to make it relevant back to their lives, to ensure that that information is still moving through short-term memory into working memory into long-term memory. So this could be where you start to assign some small group activities. Again, hopefully by this point, you know which students have access to internet, which don't. You're able to start to group them in a way that makes sense. If you have a group of students who do not have access to internet, maybe finding out, do they have phones? You know, are they able to call each other and to do it? It could be partner activities. Again, they don't have to be large group. Another great feature within Zoom, if you are using Zoom as your platform, is that you can do breakout sessions. So it could be something that you simply launch the Zoom session, but you put them into small groups where they can interact through the Zoom session, and you're just kind of out there facilitating and listening. A couple of other things as we think about the learner-to-learner interaction. Again, some of these I already touched on, but if you are teaching synchronously, again, allowing maybe for some peer teaching. That could be where if you use a feature like Breakout in Zooms, you send them in a small group and they're teaching. But this is also a great time to make assignments to students and say, hey, next week we're going to be talking about biomes. I would really love it if you and maybe 3 other students would get together. I want you to teach this back to the class. What is it you've been able to go out and research and come up with? And what would you want to share with someone else that you've learned about a particular topic? Again, doing live presentations. This is also a great time to do group passion projects. I've seen a lot of teachers initiating things like Genius Hour within their class. Lots of different ways that you can take advantage of having them live. If they are not live with you, they are asynchronous. Again, things like collaborative writing. One of the techniques that we use a lot within our team when we're doing professional learning are what we call written conversations. You provide an article or information in a Google Doc. You share the Google Doc with different groups of students, and then they go in and post their comments using the commenting feature. So they can have a conversation together, but they're doing it asynchronously through the document. And lastly, taking advantage of the phone. Believe it or not, my girls have seen me physically using a phone, our home phone, as well as my cell phone more than ever. Taking the time to pick up the phone and encouraging your students to have conversations. Again, especially if they don't have regular access to the internet. Something else that's been really interesting that my neighbor was actually, she has 3 daughters who are all middle grades in high school. They have started with pen pals again, where they are physically writing letters and mailing them. It's just another great way for the students to correspond. They're really excited to get their letter, and it's how they're working on a project together. Takes a little bit more time, but that's something that they communicated to their teacher, is that 2 of the people that they really wanted to work with do not have regular internet access during the day. So they're doing everything through the mail. Couple of other things to have the opportunity to think about. I saw this pop up, I think earlier in the chat, the importance of brain breaks. They are so important. Even in a 30-minute span of time, building in 15 seconds, 15 to 20 seconds to give your students that break can make all the difference in the world. One thing that we have learned is give them specific things that they are allowed to do during the brain break. Things like, you know, just quickly stand up, stretch, dance, grab a snack, and, you know, a drink. The biggest thing to stress to them, don't leave the webinar, because then you will find yourself trying to yell across the screen, come back, it's time to come back. And you're trying to reassess, do you have everybody? And again, recognizing that you have that 30-minute span of time, really maximize it. So being a big believer of modeling what we share, I'm actually going to give you a 15-second brain break. So I'm going to start my little handy dandy timer. Hopefully you will be able to hear it. If not, you can see the countdown. But take 15 seconds, stretch, grab a quick drink or a snack, and we will jump back in. All right, if anybody was wondering, this is actually a timer I got off of YouTube. If you go out to YouTube and put in any amount of time that you need, there are so many different timers that pop up. which is great. For this one, I did 15. We would probably recommend in a 30-minute span that you give more like 30 seconds to a minute. But again, totally your call of what you want to be able to give your students and where they are. As we start to think about and wrap up a model lesson, we also know the importance of things like exit tickets. These might be things that you were already doing in your class when you were teaching with them in person. They are equally as important to bring back into your remote lessons. So if you are teaching either recording or live, so synchronous or asynchronous, be sure to have those exit tickets. Ask your students, and you could give them a question to choose from. You could give them the whole list and say, I want you to choose one of these and quickly jump into the chat window, and I want you to answer it. There are great prompts by Bloom's, the AAR. I love the 3 ticket folders, big questions. These is just a variety of different ways. This also comes from Todd Finley. That's why I was sharing. He has so many amazing graphics and ideas out there. But again, they're just great ways. These could also be ways that you could start a lesson and end a lesson of just asking them, how are you today? Where are you? How are you feeling? One of the things that we did early on, if some of you joined the discussions early on, is we put emojis up on the screen. And we just quickly, as people joined the discussion, we said, which emoji best represents how you're feeling right now? That told us so much about our audience and where they were in their thinking. That really helped to inform and drive how we interacted with them throughout the discussion. So now I ask you the question, how are you currently meeting the needs of all learners? So again, if you have some really creative ways or just ways that you've gone back in the archives and said, this is just great pedagogy in general, we would love to hear from you in the chat how you feel like you're really modifying, differentiating instruction in order to meet the needs of all your learners. So I'll give you a couple seconds just to think, decide if there's something you want to share. If something comes to mind as we dive a little bit deeper into the conversation, we would always love to hear from you in the chat. I'm looking to see, there's one optional question session students can join. Absolutely. I love the idea. Again, very important for you to have dedicated office hours where students or parents can contact you with specific questions, but it's also great just to have a Q&A session. Just tell your students, all right, I'm going to have the Zoom open for 30 to 45 minutes. This is your chance to pop in, ask questions. You can get feedback from your peers. You can get feedback from me. Just giving them that opportunity to jump in and ask questions. Choice boards, absolutely love them. We're going to talk a little bit about choice boards. Those are really big. Creating tutorial sites. All of these are fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, and please continue to populate them. Laura and I love to see these, because don't be surprised if they pop up in a future discussion where we can continue to repurpose and share. All right, as we continue to think about, I heard someone in the chat, and I saw a couple of you mention the idea of choice boards. They are a great way in order to differentiate instruction and really meet the needs of your learners, especially recognizing you don't know what their day-to-day might look like at home, being very conscientious of whether or not they are caring for young siblings during the day. Are they helping their parents out with other things? You know, what is their home dynamic like? It may not be quiet for a single minute all day until 9 o'clock at night. And that's whenever they sit down and start to do their work. But by providing choice, it sets them up to really feel like they have some control in their life right now, and they get to have some decisions. Hyperdocs are also a great way in order to be able to provide information, as well as playlists. Again, all of these take very similar form and fashion. There are a few that I'll see if Laura can pop out there into the chat. If not, we'll make sure that we share them at the very end. But there are several different websites that we found that have templates for each of these, and just lots of different ways to stop and think about how you might differentiate for students, recognizing their varying needs. Consider recording. Again, even if you're doing a live session, take a couple minutes to press the record button. I know some of you may be a little nervous. It's like, oh, I've never done recordings. I don't like the way I hear. I don't like the way that I look. The beauty is you can kind of minimize the video screen. You can always turn your video off so your students don't hear you, but they don't see you, they just hear you. But again, recording your lessons is so huge for your students. Even for those students, if they join live, for them to know that they can go back and replay, rewind, fast forward, and just grab the information over and over again. Again, remembering very early on, 98% of what they hear the very first time doesn't make its way past that sensory cortex area. This is where giving them the capacity to go back and look at it over and over again is really instrumental. When you record your lessons, we've gotten some questions on, well, how do I share it back out? One of the things that I did is I went out to YouTube and I created a private YouTube channel. When you create a channel, you can set up all the parameters of giving passcodes that you approve who has access to be able to get to it, and then you can upload all of your videos to that site. I've seen some who are uploading them into their learning management system. If any of you have other ways that you are getting your recordings out to your students and you're willing to share them in the chat, we would love to hear from you. But again, we know the importance of getting these recordings out to your students and the benefits that they can have. Consider consistency. If any of you are familiar with Simon Sinek, he is not an educator by trade, but so much of what he shares becomes extremely relevant in the world of education. But he creates this very simplistic looking circle that you see on the right. And he talks a lot about organizations and how an organization that just focuses on what they do, they tend not to be very successful. Equally important, those who only focus on what they do and how they do it do not prove to be as successful. But organizations and companies who know why they are doing what they do, they are the ones that are the most successful. And he references companies like Google and Apple and Amazon. They know their why. They know specifically what it is that they are trying to accomplish. Then they focus on how they're going to do it and what is it that they're going to provide in order to ensure that that why is met. The same thing carries over when you are working with students remotely. Do not forget to start your lessons by sharing with them the learning goals, making it very clear to them why it is that you're teaching this concept, create some type of relevancy, and really letting them know how it aligns with the prior learning that they were doing when they were in school. I know sometimes it's very easy to forget about posting those standards at the beginning of a lesson, but it's very important for students to understand the why of the time that you're spending together. Create step-by-step instructions. If there are specific things that you want students to be able to complete and do, whether it's live or they're doing it outside of your lesson, take the time to create a step-by-step instruction guide. That can be in writing as well as a recording. This is great for students who have IEPs or your ESL, ELL population. Some of the documents that I've seen teachers creating with step-by-step, they're also putting a little visual cue next to things. So if it's that they're supposed to watch something, there's a little video icon. If they're supposed to write something, there's a pen and a piece of paper. So that again, the students that maybe struggle with reading, they can have that visual cue that helps them to understand, okay, I'm supposed to click on this because it says it's something that I'm going to watch. Structure each lesson the same. Kind of start with your standards, move into an intro activity, have something where they interact with it, and then do a conclusion. Again, the consistency, it may seem a little mundane, but it's really going to help your students to know what to expect when they log in for your lesson so that they can immediately focus and they know the structure that they can expect. Provide model examples for completed work. If there's a way that you specifically are looking for them to provide information back to you, provide a couple of examples. Let them see what it is that you're looking for whenever they turn something into you. And again, create a Q&A doc to address common questions. These might be questions that you are getting on a very regular basis from your students. And it's a great way just to say, hey, I've created a Q&A doc. Before you reach out for office time or before you send me an email, go to this document. It's possible that I've already answered it or that somebody else has already asked that same great question and I've been able to provide an answer. And again, it can be things like where to post things, talking to them about what happens if something's not turned in on time. You know, what is the structure? What is the process for them to still turn information in? So lastly, we're going to touch on this idea of providing feedback. Again, your students were so used to getting that instantaneous verbal feedback from you during class. It might have been during class, it might have been as they were walking through the door where you quickly said to them, hey, I read your report last night, or hey, that math test we took yesterday, great job on it, or hey, we need to touch base. There's a couple of things that we still need to work on. That really quick, simple interaction is no longer available to us the way that it was when they were live with us in class. But it doesn't mean that feedback is not equally important to your students and that they still need it. So I would love to hear from you in the chat. What are some creative ways that you have found to provide feedback for your students? I love the sharing emails. Secondary kids, they are great with email. Google Classroom assignments, class comments, yes. And these are a few that I'm going to touch on for the time that we have remaining. The first that I want to share are single point rubrics. If you are not familiar with single point rubrics, they will revolutionize teaching and learning, not only in a remote setting, but when you go back into the classroom. Jennifer Gonzalez with Cult of Pedagogy, she is kind of the pioneer behind single point rubrics. I wish to this day that I had known about single point rubrics or that they were even in existence when I was still in the classroom, because I struggled with rubrics. I had a lot of students, especially my students, my EC students, my ESL students, they struggled with multi-point rubrics. Parents struggled with multi-point rubrics of trying to understand, adding up the points and all the subjectivity of the points. Single point rubrics help to eliminate a lot of that, and they really put a lot of the ownership back on the student for self-assessment. So I provided two different versions of the single point rubric. If you go out to Jennifer Gonzalez's website, and Laura has posted it in the chat, there are tons of other examples that she provides. But what I love about single point rubrics is through the middle of the rubric, this area, this is what you are filling out. You are telling them what is the criteria for mastery. Not exceeding mastery, but what is it that they have to do in order to essentially pass, in order for them to demonstrate that they understand what they need to know to move on to the next concept. On the left is where they self-evaluate. How did they do? Where did they still feel like they need to improve? What are additional resources or supports that they need? This is also where you can fill in things that need to be improved upon. To the right is where they can start to document what they think they have done to demonstrate mastery beyond the criteria demonstrated through the middle. So a lot of this is them giving you the initial feedback and then you commenting on their feedback. The one to the right does provide the number system. It's a 4-point scale. And again, it's just another way that she kind of provides, if you do have students that are really hesitant to write or they struggle with writing, this is another way that they can provide their feedback. Again, the structure of the single point rubrics, you'll see that she gives you a couple of different options, but what I love about using them with secondary students is that they have ownership and they have accountability for telling you how they think that they did. Oh yes, that is a great, great, great suggestion. That also students can add emoji icons, they can give you a thumbs up. There's lots of different graphics that they can place into single point rubrics in order to tell you how they're doing and where they think they still need to work. So thank you for that suggestion. That is a great one. Another thing that I saw some of you talk about that you're providing feedback is through Google Docs. One of the things you may not know that you can do at Google Docs is not only can you add a comment, but if in the comment you put a little plus sign and the student's email address, a little area will pop up below and it'll say assigned to you. And if you check it, it will automatically send them an email notification, and they can click on your comment and it will take them into the document specifically to where you have provided comments to them. This is a great little hidden gem that, again, if nobody's ever exposed you to it, you might not know it exists. So again, just tagging the comment with an email, it will send them the information that they need. I talked about this earlier. This is something I've heard about on a couple of webinars. I've read it in some of the articles that I've been reading, how important it is to be very clear with your students how you will handle late work. Again, taking into consideration home life, job loss, life loss. We know that our students are battling a lot of different things at home, but it's still important to have criteria for when things will be due and how they should communicate to you if they are unable to meet that deadline. Again, although students may not realize it, right now more than ever, they need some structure around their learning just to help them manage their day, for them to feel like they can be successful and to be able to effectively manage multiple classes and multiple assignments. So by knowing exactly where you stand and what the process is, if they find that they are not going to be able to turn something in on time, make sure that you have clearly addressed with them how to handle it and what their options are. And it might be that they lose a certain amount of points each day, again, depending on the circumstance. But again, setting those criteria will really help your students with management. And I will wrap up by sharing this great quote that a colleague of mine shared with me. And it really was important. And it came at a time where even with my own children, I was getting extremely fixated on the resources, going into their choice boards, making sure that they were doing all of their assignments. And I really stopped and had to remember, right now, we're not trying to build links. We're trying to establish and maintain relationships. So at the end of the day, do what's in the best interest of your students. The teaching and learning will happen, but always remember to come back to who they are as individuals, what their needs are, and maintaining that relationship. Because the relationship that they have with you may be the most consistent and positive relationship that they have right now in this remote time that we are living in. So with that, I will open it up to any questions. We have a couple of minutes remaining. If you are still out there and willing to jump into the chat, I would love to know, after joining this discussion, whether you're on Twitter or not, what would your hashtag be? And if you're willing to post it in the chat, we would love to see it. And it is completely fine to be candid. If your hashtag is hashtag brain dead, hashtag overwhelmed. Hopefully it's more like hashtag excited, rejuvenated, engaged, but whatever your hashtag might be, share it out. This is another great one to do with your students, to ask them, what is your hashtag? What would it be? Again, creating relevance to things that you know that they're probably already doing, or to say, what would your TikTok include? What would your, if somebody took a photograph of you right now, what would your face look like? Getting them to post emojis about how they're feeling would be awesome. So, oh, Josh, I'm so glad you like the Google Doc tip. It's a lifesaver when you can tag emails. It saves our team a ton of time with not sending a separate email to tell somebody to go in and check the comments. So yes, love, love, love the feedback. Thank you so much. We would love to continue to hear your feedback. So in just a minute, I'm going to give you a link to a survey, which is also where you can get a copy of a certificate for participating today. If you are interested in going back and grabbing a recording of this webinar, give me till tomorrow. It will be posted on this site. Laura will also drop it into the chat for you. It is where you can also go and find all the recordings from the prior discussions that we've been having. It is where we will also continue to post our future ones. So if you have a colleague or a friend that couldn't join and there's bits of information in there that you think they would really benefit from, we would love for you to share the recording with them. Again, they are open for anybody that would benefit from watching them. If you are interested in accessing the slide deck from today, you can visit this bit.ly. Laura will also drop that out there for you in just a minute. I'm making her work hard today. dropping in bunches of links for me. But just bit.ly/FI Connect, that will give you access to the slides. And we will continue the conversation with secondary educators on Wednesday, April the 29th. We are going to continue to dive into this idea of differentiation, but we are going to go down the path of better understanding things like executive functioning skills for our students, meaning their capacity to be organized, to prioritize, all of those things that we know may be falling off a little bit in the settings that they're in. How do you kind of get them back on track? We're also going to talk a little bit about motivation, intrinsic versus extrinsic, and how do you help your students to be intrinsically motivated during this time to do the work, especially for a lot of them who are sitting there thinking, well, I'm not getting grades, or we don't have to take the end of course test or the end of grade test. So what's the point? We're going to talk a little bit about some tips and strategies for keeping them motivated and for you to stay motivated as well, because we will be right at the cusp of hopefully coming out of COVID-19, but recognizing that motivation may be running a little slow. So again, we hope that you will plan to join us back on April the 29th. Here is the link to the survey. We are right at 3 o'clock. Laura is going to drop this in there. We would absolutely love your feedback. It does help to inform the discussions and the topics that we talk about. When you complete the survey and hit the submit button, pay attention to the message that appears on your screen, because there will be a link in it where you can generate your certificate for participating. So if you want to be able to grab that certificate, make sure you pay attention to that after you hit the submit button. And again, we thank you so much for joining us. We hope the information was helpful, that you got some little nuggets of information you can take back and start applying. As always, please do not hesitate to reach out if we can be of any further assistance. You can also post your questions in the survey. But otherwise, have a great rest of the afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you back in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everybody.